This is a scene from the hit HBO fantasy series called Game of Thrones. That super white girl was one of the contenders for the throne. She was tough and sexy and mysterious, and she had a pair of dragons. But I think one of the reasons she was so popular with viewers is that she was a white woman freeing black men from chains. That was one of her official titles in the show, Breaker of Chains, just in case the show was too subtle for you. And that's the ultimate white liberal dream, isn't it? To free slaves, but not just any slaves, to free black slaves. And why not? Slavery is a stain on society, and it remains the United States of America's worst moral error, and its costliest error too. The U.S. Civil War cost more lives than all other U.S. wars combined, and its seeds of discontent linger on through the era of Jim Crow and segregation, and even the racially tinged riots that we've seen these past weeks. But that's not actually what a liberator of slaves looks like. This is what a liberator of slaves looks like. That's who did it. That's Queen Victoria. Well, it wasn't just her, of course. The United Kingdom spent a century fighting against slavery, and I don't mean going to protests and saying, hey, hey, ho, ho, slavery has got to go in it. No, they actually fought against slavery. They dispatched the Royal Navy, the greatest military force in the world at the time, to stop slavery. This isn't the statue of Queen Victoria that I know and love. I know the one right outside Buckingham Palace. It's stunning. I hope you get the chance to see it one day in person. This statue apparently is in Leeds, and it was violated, desecrated. Look at that. BLM, Black Lives Matter, and murderer. And I think they spray painted her breasts because these protesters are quite woke, I guess. I think this is a shot of the same statue from another perspective, BLM slave owner, and slag, which is a British way of saying the derogatory word slut. But is it true? Did Queen Victoria kill blacks and enslave blacks? No. Neither did Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, who freed 4 million slaves after the bloodiest war in U.S. history. Neither did Winston Churchill, who led the West against Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Now you might think, look, that's a mindless mob that defaced the statues. They're uneducated, they're animalistic in nature, not thinking, only feeling. Facts don't matter to their feelings. Right. But this Western wave of violence and revolution is intellectually endorsed by people who should know better, by professors, by politicians, by the entire idea establishment, especially the media. It's worst in the media, here in Canada too. The mindless attacks on Rex Murphy for simply saying he thinks Canada is not systematically racist. I'm deeply embarrassed for the National Post that they bent the knee to their know-nothing millennial junior writers and let them have an op-ed calling for the deplatforming of Rex Murphy. I won't go through the whole argument again there. I did a monologue on that last week. To be clear, my objection isn't that some woke junior staffer disagrees with Rex. It's that her argument was Rex shouldn't be able to speak at all because he's a white man. It's like that image from the Maoist Cultural Revolution I showed you the other day. If Rex won't denounce himself like so many others are doing to him, well, then we have to stuff a cloth in his mouth to literally shut him up. But can I ask you a question? And it involves history and a little bit of reading, so there's just no chance the millennial gripers who are thrilled by this wave of violence will know anything about it. Can I ask you, what is Queen Victoria's record on slavery? And what's ours? What's our Canadian record of slavery? Do Black Lives Matter here? Now, there has been slavery in every continent of the world except Antarctica. There was slavery throughout indigenous America before Columbus arrived. Slavery was an important part of Indian warfare and Indian economy in British Columbia, for example, for centuries. Slavery is a curse. It's as old as murder, really. In a way, it's the perpetual threat of murder. I own you. You must always do what I say, or I could kill you. And I am making permanent that threat by calling you my property to do with as I please. I am taking away any of your dignity or property in yourself. I own you. That's an ancient sin and crime, and it has threatened to manifest itself everywhere that humans have lived, and it has. But my case today is that we didn't let it take root in Canada. We did not. In fact, I think Canada is probably one of the least slavey places in the whole world. And I tell you that so that when some know-nothing on Twitter or some know-nothing working at the National Post, or Toronto Star, or Globe and Mail, or CBC tells you how racist you are, because we're all racist, because this country's racist, you can deny it with facts and hopefully with your feelings too. Let's go back a bit. How does 1772 suit you? That's before the United States had its revolution. That's before the French Revolution too. Here's a court ruling from the UK called Somerset versus Stewart. Let me read a bit. On return to a habeas corpus requiring Captain Knowles to show cause for the seizure and detaining of the complainant Somerset, a Negro, the case appeared to be this. Okay, some old-fashioned language there. Somerset was a black man. Captain Knowles had seized and detained him as a slave, and Somerset sued, referring to the ancient British tradition of habeas corpus. As you know, you can't arrest someone without having some proof they've done something wrong. That's called habeas corpus. It's actually Latin for have the body. As in, you have to have some proof that there was a crime going on if you're going to hold a man, seize him, detain him. Police can't just pick you up without habeas corpus. So if you're treating someone as a slave, well, you just can't do it because you want to do it. You're treating him like a prisoner. Prove that he should be a prisoner. That's what the law says. I'll read just a little bit more because it's a bit old-fashioned and legalistic language, as you would expect from 250 years ago. The Negro had been a slave to Mr. Stewart in Virginia, had been purchased from the African coast. In the course of the slave trade, as tolerated in the plantations, he had been brought over to England by his master, who, intending to return by force, sent him on board of a Captain Knowles's vessel, lying in the river, and was there, by the order of his master, in the custody of Captain Knowles, detained against his consent until returned in obedience to the writ. Okay, so he's brought from Africa to the colonies and then to Britain. And here's what the judges said about that. The question on that is not whether slavery is lawful in the colonies, where a concurrence of unhappy circumstances has caused it to be established as necessary, but whether in England, not whether it has ever existed in England, but whether it be now abolished. Now, maybe I shouldn't, I want to read this all to you, I just don't have time. It's a wonderful ruling. For the next paragraph, the judges give the most forceful denunciation of slavery, I think, that I've ever read. They describe its immorality, its corrupting effect actually on the slave master too, its practical effects on all of humanity, and mainly on the rights of the slave. It is a wonderful ruling. Can I invite you to Google it and read it for yourself? It's called Somerset's case. Anyways, the judges here don't try to ban slavery throughout the British Empire. I don't think they had the jurisdiction. This was just some guy in a boat in the river. But a slave presented himself and said, look, I'm in England. England does not allow slavery. And the judges said, by George, you're right. Shall an attempt to introduce perpetual servitude here to this island hope for countenance? Will not all the other mischiefs of mere utter servitude revive? And this, incompatible with the mild and human precepts of Christianity. And this, 'tis very doubtful whether the laws of England will permit a man to bind himself by contract to serve for life. As in, you're not even allowed to sign a contract to be a slave for your whole life. You just won't be allowed to do it by the government. This is 250 years ago this was written. These judges just wouldn't have it. Anyhow, amazing case. It was shortly after that case that William Wilberforce's Committee for the Abolition of Slave Trade dedicated itself to the project of banning slavery everywhere, really. That's the subject of the movie Amazing Grace. I should say it again. As the judges said, Christianity was the motivating force for Wilberforce, for so many of the other abolitionists. It was mentioned in the court cases I showed you. I contrast that with Islam, which legalizes and normalizes slavery, both slavery of men and the rape slavery of women. Muhammad himself had slaves. Christianity is unusual in not only its rejection of slavery, but its motivation to redeem captives around the world. And that's such a key point here. The UK was ridding itself of whatever vestiges of slavery were in its own island. That's what Somerset's case said. It didn't ban slavery in the 13 colonies in America. It's just said, don't bring your slavery here back to England. We won't accept it. That's bold. But then the Brits said, all right, well, let's free the whole world. They actually said that, and they went about doing that. And not by rioting and looting their own cities. Look at this. An act for the abolition of the slave trade It was passed in Parliament in 1807. Now, it didn't ban slavery itself in the British Empire, but it banned the slave trade. So if you were already a slave, it did not free you yet. But it was a direct attack on the industry of slavery, the capturing of slaves, the shipment of slaves to auctions. It was the starter pistol for the Royal Navy's Great War on Slave Traders back in 1807. And if that wasn't tough enough, well, it got tougher. The Slave Trade Felony Act turned slave trading into a crime on par with piracy. And if you don't know, pirates, especially back then, were deemed to be outside the law. It's sort of like terrorists. They had very few rights in law. They could be executed almost on sight after a drumhead trial. To be a slave trader in the face of the Slave Trade Felony Act was as risky back then as being a member of ISIS. Now, actually riskier. They didn't have a Guantanamo Bay. They just killed them. Back then they had Royal Navy ships, not drones. The Royal Navy set up a special fleet just for the purpose of stopping slave ships. They called it the West Africa Squadron. It was fully 1/6 of the entire Royal Navy, ships and Marines. Over the course of 50 years, this was a 50-year war against slavery. This West Africa Squadron seized 1,600 different slave ships. 1,600. Can you imagine? They freed 150,000 Africans who were being shipped to slave markets. It's like Schindler's List. Now, these were not British citizens. This was not actually in the economic interests of Britain or the colonies. This was purely done as a moral expression of British and Christian ideology in the face of evil. It wasn't just military. Britain signed treaties with countries throughout Africa to press them to stop the slave trade. This had never happened before in history. Forget your Daenerys Targaryen Game of Thrones. This was on Queen Victoria's watch. This was the woman who was freeing the world. You know, Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem that is now obviously considered racist. Even its title, it's called The White Man's Burden. I don't even know if you're allowed to say the name of the poem anymore, let alone read from it, but I do want to read a little bit from it. It's published in 1899, 121 years ago. It was Kipling's view about the British Empire, about how Britain was taking pains to bring Western ideas of morality and law and health and wealth to the whole world, and was just being blamed for it no matter. Let me read a few passages. What do you think of this? Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. I'm not going to read any more. It's probably illegal to read Kipling now. I'm quite sure his statues will be taken down across the UK as they're toppling other statues even as I speak. You know, they toppled the statue of Christopher Columbus in Richmond, Virginia the other day. Hey, if you hate living in America so much, if you hate the idea that Columbus came there, leave. Why blame the man who discovered it if you're going to enjoy his discovery? If you hate Christopher Columbus for discovering America, if you don't believe he discovered it, but rather think he invaded and stole it from Indians, then how can you possibly morally, ethically still live there? It's like you're in a stolen house. Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. So they're passing law after law after law. Basically, that law said, okay, we're done, it's over. It's now illegal to have a slave anywhere in the entire British Empire, except in a few technical exceptions that I won't get into here. And I want to tell you something stunning that I did not actually know until now. So if someone had bought a slave over the years, anywhere in the British Empire, and had the knowledge and security that what they were doing was lawful when they bought the slave, even if it was immoral, it was lawful. Well, this abolition of slavery, in a way, was taking away the property right they had in the slave. Of course, because people aren't property. But they had been in law for years, even if it wasn't moral. So the British Empire did something that I did not know about. And I wonder if you had ever heard of this before either, because for some reason, they don't teach it in schools. And I doubt the Black Lives Matter protesters know this either. The British Empire literally paid to liberate and emancipate every single slave in the empire. They didn't have a civil war about it. They didn't kill 500,000 of their own souls in a bloody battle over slavery. They emancipated all the slaves by paying out their slave owners, redeeming the slaves as the Bible tells Christians to do. The British Empire borrowed 20 million pounds back in 1833. Do you know how much money that is in today's currency? That's more than 100 billion pounds in today's money. And we're talking British pounds. So we're talking close to $250 billion Canadian mini dollars. It was the size of 40% of the entire revenues of the empire. In fact, that special slave redemption loan, they borrowed the money, would not be paid off until, I'm not even kidding, it was only paid off 5 years ago. More than a century, Brits have been paying interest on that emancipation loan. So let's recap. Britain banned the slave trade. Then they created a special force in the Royal Navy and Marines that went to war against slave ships for half a century, freeing 150,000 slaves and stopping countless more from being enslaved. And then they made slave trading a crime tantamount to terrorism, and then they banned slavery outright and incurred a 180-year mortgage of $250 billion Canadian dollars to redeem slaves. That's the United Kingdom. White people, by the way, Christians, by the way, only Abraham Lincoln rivals that effort. And as he wrote to a New York newspaper in 1862, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. So, yes, he freed the slaves, 4 million, and he was a great, great president, but freeing the slaves was not his main purpose. His main purpose was stopping the South from seceding. He hated slavery, obviously, but he didn't dedicate his entire country's efforts just to eradicating slavery per se. The British Empire did. And of course, Canada was part of that British Empire. And let me close by showing you something that I never learned in school. And I went to school in Canada. And I want to learn about Canada because it's my country. When did we get involved in this? What's our role? Are we racist? As Trudeau, the ignoramus, says. Trudeau, who's never read a book that wasn't a comic.
But it is a time for us as Canadians to recognize that we too have our challenges. That Black Canadians and racialized Canadians face discrimination as a lived reality every single day. There is systemic discrimination in Canada, which means our systems treat Canadians of color, Canadians who are racialized, differently than they do others.
Yeah, read a book, you liar. Here's the truth. On July 9th, 1793, the Parliament of Upper Canada, that's what they called Canada back then, it wasn't Canada, we passed an act against slavery. It banned the slave trade. No slaves could be brought to Canada. And of the slaves already here, anyone born to a slave would automatically be freed upon reaching the age of 25. Now, it wasn't a huge issue. There weren't a lot of slaves in Canada to begin with. I read one census that put the black population of Toronto at the time at around 16 people. But if there was any doubt, it was flattened. John Simcoe, the lieutenant governor of Upper Canada, was an abolitionist. I'm sure they'll tear down his statue too and rename anything with the word Simcoe in it, just like they're defacing everything else, white and male and old. But John Simcoe abolished slavery more than 200 years ago. He helped make Canada the place to which Black Americans fled when they escaped slavery. That is our Canadian history. I'm going to read a bit from this law because you're not going to see this on the CBC or in the Toronto Star. Let me read from the law, more than 200 years old. Whereas it is unjust that a people who enjoy freedom by law should encourage the introduction of slavery in this province. And whereas it is highly expedient to abolish slavery in this province, so far as the same may gradually be done without violating private property. To grant a license for importing into the same any Negro or Negroes shall be, and the same is hereby repealed. And that from and after the passing of this act, it shall not be lawful for the governor, lieutenant governor, or other person administrating the government of this province to grant a license for the importation any Negro or other person to be subjected to the condition of a slave, or to a bounden involuntary service for life, into any part of the province, nor shall any Negro or other person who shall come or be brought into this province after the passing of this act be subject to the condition of a slave, or to such service as aforesaid within this province, nor shall any voluntary contract of service or indentures that may be entered into by any parties within this province after the passing of this act be binding on them or either of them for a longer time than a term of 9 years from the date of such a contract. So it's done. You couldn't even sign a contract to be a slave. 9-year work term is the maximum. I'll read a little bit more. I thought this was interesting. The children that shall be born of female slaves to remain in the service of the owner of their mother until the age of 25 years when they shall be discharged. So this law didn't set free all the existing slaves yet. That came from Britain along with a redemption payment later. But until then, the Canadian law protected the treatment of slaves in a way. Look at this. Such master or mistress shall, and is hereby required, to give proper nourishment and clothing to such child or children, and shall and may put such child or children to work, and shall and may retain him or her in their service until every such child shall have attained the age of 25 years, at which time they and each of them shall be entitled to demand his or her discharge from, and shall be discharged by such master or mistress for the service. So they actually had a duty of care towards children. I won't go on, but let me end by quoting my friend Alam Bokhari. Now, I don't know exactly Alam's background, but I know he comes from the UK. But before that, I know his people came from somewhere else in the British Empire. And like so many people who were the subjects of that happy and gentle empire, he knows that despite all of its flaws, the British Empire was the best thing to ever happen to a place in the world, because it brought the rule of law and justice and education and health and construction, and it brought the liberal precepts of Christianity even to lands that had never heard of it before, and they were the breakers of chains. And here's what my friend Alam said last night, and oh, did it cause a fuss. He said, and he's not white, he said, white people abolished slavery. And you know what? It's true. Now, there is still slavery in parts of the world, in Africa, in Arabia, in parts of Asia, even in China. There are more than 1 billion people who follow a prophet who not only kept slaves himself, but instructed his followers on the power you have over a slave. You can kill a male slave, you can rape a woman slave. Best not to talk about that, though. Yeah, every country has its flaws, because every human being has flaws. Queen Victoria, other than Moses himself, no one in history freed or saved or stopped more slavery than Queen Victoria. And we Canadians were right beside her in the fight. In fact, we were passing anti-slavery laws in Canada decades before she was even born. Black Lives Matter? Yeah, mate, we know. Because we're Canadians. Maybe read a book. That's an excerpt from my daily show, the Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.